So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and today Troy McLachlan is back, and we are going to talk about structural changes and upheaval that are on the horizon. And a lot of it, what comes true and what not, will depend on us. We'll see. So, Troy, very good to see you. Happy to have you. And how are you?
Oh no, it's great to be back. Very interesting times. Only going to get more interesting, I think, as the year progresses. Truly in some kind of an end game scenario, I think, at this time, with a lot of what people see as a normal world passing away to something else. Yeah, it's very interesting times indeed.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kick it off. Edward Dowd, he's an investor. Some of you might know him. I have a quote from him, and he said, I have decided to unilaterally rebrand disease X. It is now disease DIC, debt implosion cover-up. The problem with that quote is I can't find the original source, meaning a video clip or something that he wrote. I cannot find that. Be that as it may, the quote I found in a different article, yeah, and that was
Right.
not written by him. But be that as it may, I mean, we have two things here, disease X, that's a huge subject right now
Mhm.
in Davos. And we also have debt implosion cover up. So, what do you think? Is it possible that a debt implosion is coming?
I've been waiting for, the mother of all debt implosions, something that I believe happens every 400 years or so, in
Mm,
terms of the economic cycles. But whenever you have a debt-based financial system, particularly a global debt-based financial system, you are going to get a debt implosion at some point. The key for the powers that be, the people who initially foist this debt-based system on us, is that when the inevitable debt implosion takes place, they need to reposition themselves to reintroduce the same system pretty much soon after the cataclysm, the debt inspired cataclysm, so as to maintain their control over the financial system of the world, or down through history, whichever continent or empire they happen to be controlling at that time. But the idea is that they do need events of huge magnitude to basically to serve as cover, not so much cover up, but to serve as actual cover for resetting a system that is always guaranteed to reach the stage that we're at the moment. And unfortunately, when they do this, it often leads to the deaths of millions, if not billions, of people in our current modern context, but certainly millions of people in the past. The last time that you saw a reset of this magnitude take place would, well, you have a major one at the early 20th century, which saw the imposition of the Federal Reserve in the United States. But if you go back to the French Revolution and the various financial crises that led up to all the different types of financial crises that they were having during those years, that's what I think we are facing at this time. And it's a cyclical process that I have always argued has been around literally since the days of ancient Babylon. There's always this process of building up an economy with a debt-based system that's great at the beginning, implodes later to the cost of many people's actual lives, and rinse, repeat, try it again. So I think we're definitely on the cusp of that, and I think this year is going to be pivotal
mm,
as far as what that quote implies.
mm. When you say pivotal, that does not necessarily mean it will happen this year.
I believe that we are also going through a period that is very similar to the Reformation, the time of Martin Luther and the advent of the printing press with Gutenberg and so on, with the internet playing the role that Gutenberg's printing press played back in those days, where information, rather than standing armies, is what is deciding the direction of society in general. Particularly here in the in what people would call the Western world, the Christian world that we inhabit. We are undergoing that exact same gravitas of change that Gutenberg's printing press facilitated all those years ago, or all those centuries ago. It means that there are, I believe, enough of us now to know that the system is rotten in its inception when they have instituted it. This vast global, this what I often refer to as a hidden kingdom of merchant bankers that have controlled the destiny of so many nations on this planet, at least for the last 250 years. The change from that is that there are enough people now understanding that we can't have that break down only to replace it with a newer and nastier version, as has happened since the time of Gutenberg. In the time of Gutenberg, it was very much the focus was on the religious side of things, the corruption that the Catholic Church represented, the advent of the new Protestant way of thinking and so on like that. And this dramatically changed. This time, it is very much about the economic interests of people, nations, countries and so on, and the role that central banking and its international debt-based financial system has led us down in the last century, the most murderous century in human history, without a doubt. I think enough people through the internet are starting to realize that we can't allow what essentially is a private institution the monopoly to issue our currency as a false measurement of pricing and value, because that's what interest currency issued under interest as a debt, with an interest payment as a debt. It's a false measure, and it ultimately leads to a massive implosion where a vast majority of people lose everything, and in many cases their lives.
Yeah, that's true. Here in Germany, we have a saying. When I translate it, it goes roughly like this: your money is not gone, it's just that somebody else has it.
Yeah, that's Catherine Fitz, a former secretary in the housing department. You probably know of her, and so on. Often talks about the money system that they have is very much the Pillsbury Doughboy, the fat, floury sort of thing for the Quakers, I think it was. Some company anyway did flour. You squeeze him in one area and he bulges out in another. So when your money is squeezed out of you, it goes into the pockets of somebody else and so on. But it's not quite the overall analogy to look at that, because inevitably that squeezing, the money is already designated to go to a certain place, which is, it's the 1% of the 1% who will always benefit from this. Their problem is, how do they maintain their ill-gotten wealth through a corrupt system into the next phase of resetting the system, so that they don't lose it, all to, righteous indignation, the revolutionary reaction that most people are going to have to these people being able to gain such wealth through such a system. And I think that's I would say that's their panic at the moment, and the way things are going. That's why stupid mistakes are being made. that panic and the fact that you've heard me say this on your show many times. Today's Rothschilds, today's merchant bankers are not your great grandfathers, not Rothschilds and merchant bankers and people like that. Those former generations of the big banking concerns and so on like that, they were genuine geniuses. They were very highly competent people. Their descendants are anything but competent. So it makes for a very interesting show to watch, but a very frightening one as well, which is always the case when you start talking about people's accumulated wealth, what they've worked for. Everybody gets frightened when the idea that you could lose everything that you've worked for comes into the picture. And I'm afraid, that's what we're facing here in the West at this time.
Oh yeah. Sometimes I have a strong feeling the West is done.
Yeah, I think the West is going to fracture. I think the English-speaking, or what you would call the Anglo-American sphere, is going to become so isolated because of its support of central banking, the role. One could have a sympathetic viewpoint on this, that the British Empire was used for a period of time to enforce the dictates of this financial system. And when America became the powerful entity on the planet, the American military might was also used. And so therefore, it's really a story of an unwitting nations being used in by these banking interests to enforce their dictates, their wants for how the system is perpetuated. But the fact of the matter is that for the last 200 years, it has been the Anglosphere that's gone around basically making sure everybody toes the line, whether it's the British pound or whether it's the American dollar. That is coming to an end. And as a result of all of that history, the Anglosphere is going to be very much a pariah. So I can see the British Isles, the North American continent, not so much Mexico, but Canada and America, Australia, New Zealand, becoming an isolated entity on the planet. It's not such a bad thing, really, because the resources that the North American continent has means that those countries can survive within themselves, but they just will not have the power to exercise control over the rest of the planet. And so Europe will ultimately be its own entity. The debate is, do they ultimately gravitate towards the BRICS bloc? Because I see the future very much in terms of on a global level, in terms of what the BRICS are creating, the dynamic that is going there, and the way that they have captured the imagination of what people call the global South, and so on. But with all the economic aspects, with the support that the West has given to Israel in the current conflict, the state of Israel, and so on like that, the rest of the world is just simply going to not want to have anything to do with the Anglosphere anymore, including Western Europe, including the whole of Europe. And I see today that Europe gravitates more towards, and people will react very harshly in some quarters to what I'm saying and such, but gravitate more towards dealing with Russia as a partner, as opposed to an enemy. It's my contention that the idea that Russia is some boogeyman that we've all got to hate and so on like that is very much an Anglosphere construct. And I see Eastern Europe, I see the whole of Europe ultimately understanding. I mean, they'll be energy dependent on Russia. There is no doubt about that. That has to be sorted out. And such. The Ukrainian conflict is winding down now. I think people are starting to see a very different perspective on what was going on there. And, it is actually my hope that Europe and Russia sort of enter into an age of peace between them, because, let's face it, whether it's Germany and Russia or Germany and France or France and Russia, There's just been so much conflict and destruction. And again, I would point to the central banking systems that, that also had their influences in Europe as being central behind that. But I'm hoping that you will see sort of an age of peace that will develop between those spheres of influence, Europe and the Russian sphere, and then ultimately the BRICS and so on. And this may seem harsh, but the Anglosphere can be left to its own devices to get its own house in order. And that's how I see the next 50 years playing out.
Yeah, yeah. So we also know, and I was thinking if that is one of the reasons why we see this debt orgy going on.
Yeah.
We know that right now 130 central banks are feverishly working on CBDCs.
Mm.
So, do you think that one of the thoughts behind it is, yeah, well, let's we we have to crash the old system anyhow, then we will go with CBDC, so it doesn't really matter if
Yeah.
there is a billion more or less.
Mm.
Do you think it has something to do with that?
Very much so. I think that is actually, in a nutshell, their plan for the reset, to move into a cashless society in which your entire life is dictated according to your central bank digital currency footprint, your account or whatever. This is how they're policing nations at the moment. This ridiculousness of the idea that they're going to confiscate Russia's frozen assets and give it to Ukraine. Well, this is a scalable concept. If they can do it to Russia, they can do it to you. And,
Sure.
So it's as simple as that. It's the ultimate form of control. Basically, I've argued this. It's a biblical concept of the mark of the beast. You make your money either by manual labor or intellectual labor, beforehand for the forehead, and so you take, or your bounty that you create is taken by this bestial system, whereby you cannot buy or sell unless you're part of it. And their whole idea of generating these 15-minute cities, totally restricting any access into the countryside in the name of protecting the ecology, the environment, all of these aspects that they're looking at, the forms of control that say this is where you will live, this will be your carbon footprint, this will be what we allow you to have, we will give you a guaranteed income, but if you don't toe the line the way we see it, we have the power to literally starve you out because you can't buy, you haven't got access to your money. At least in a cash system, people who had the foresight always had that ability to have the freedom that cash could bring, to be able to escape that kind of control. Once the Western world goes full central bank digital currency, any concept of freedom that is divergent from what they consider you should live your life like will automatically be starved out through basically cutting you off from access to the lifeblood that is money that drives any economy. And it will be issued as a debt. There will be an interest based on it. When you look at cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, don't confuse that with what the banks are talking about. It's a totally different thing. The Bitcoin and these other currencies, they are not issued as a form of debt. All right. And such, they're just there to be utilized as a means of exchange, a means of wealth storage, and so on, that money sort of has. The central bank digital currency will continue the age-old, all the way back to ancient Babylon, the age-old idea that the debtor is always slave to the lender. And in this case, the bank maintains its status as it maintains its monopoly as the lender to the nation, to the people, and on a global scale. That's what they hope there will be. There'll be no more nations. It'll, if they can have it their way, it'll just simply be a global central bank, and you will be its slave because it will lend you its central bank digital currency to live the life that they think you should live.
Yeah. And let's not forget, we saw that in China. In China already a couple, it's not a couple, quite literally thousands and thousands have a digital wallet from the Chinese central bank.
Mm-hmm.
And this currency, of course, is programmable. That means that they can program. Let's say you have $2,000, but in that month, for some reason, you only used 1,800.
Mm-hmm.
You will not take the 200 into the next month because it has best before.
Yeah, can you imagine it?
Yeah.
Yeah. In other
Meaning
words, you'll never be able to save.
Exactly.
I mean, to the German mind, your nation, that must be total anathema. You're the greatest savers on the planet, apart from possibly the Japanese. But it's just incredible.
Yeah, but the German masses don't even understand what is
Taking
going to
place. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So also they can program it. Let's say you can't buy a gun with it. You can't buy alcohol with it. You can't buy this or that or the other, whatever is deemed to be not.
Can't buy Troy McLachlan's Saturn Death Cult book,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
they don't want you to know those crazy ideas that he has, So that's exactly it. It's the ultimate form of control. You can neither buy nor sell to a level that I don't think the writers of the Bible even imagined. They were just looking at the whole sort of concept of old style temple banking and such like that. But this technological control is total.
Yeah. And today I read an article. The headline was Donald Trump vows not to allow CBDCs in the US. And I was reminded of an interview many years ago when Alan Greenspan was still heading the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
And in that interview, he very blatantly said, the American president has no business meddling in the decisions of the Federal Reserve. And so how realistic is that when Donald Trump says something like that?
Well, it is, it's highly realistic that he could do it, but the central banks have always been able to fight back simply because they have that monopoly over the issuance of money, where they can destroy an economy and the blame sits on the president or whatever. This is how they've been manipulating history all the way through. They will that sort of dialectic sort of concept of playing both sides against each other to get the people that you want that will work with you and your policies, and so you can destroy it. They did it to Kennedy. They did it to Lincoln back after when he tried to issue what they were called Lincoln greenbacks as a way of as a way of reviving the economy. After the Napoleonic Wars, the Bank of England did the same thing to the Isle of Jersey, that had all these ex-soldiers who were unemployed, no money or whatever, and somebody hit upon the idea, hey, let's start our own currency here. And it worked very well. And the Bank of England said, no, we can't have that because we don't control what you're doing. And that's the whole aspect of central banking. It's a control mechanism, over these people. So when Donald Trump says something like that, in the last 100 years, central bankers would have just laughed at his naivety as doing it. What makes things different today is Bitcoin. It is the cryptocurrencies that give everybody an opportunity to get away from the banks. And it is also the fact that he has done a very good job of highlighting to people that actually the problem in the economy is the central bank and its monetary policy, not its fiscal policy, but its monetary policy, the way it issues money, the way it introduces money, the way it controls money. And, we have to remember that in terms of, what I call this hidden, this kingdom of hidden merchant bankers that have been running things around the world. The central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, is a private corporation, and nobody knows who its actual owners are. All right, there's nothing. No one's been allowed to see who's on the books as being the owners of that corporation. But it is a fair assessment, a fair assumption that most of the owners will have their origins in the City of London, in the United Kingdom. All right, meaning that the Bank of England achieved what it set out to do after the American colonies were lost. All right, it wanted control of that massive resource called the North American continent, and undeveloped and so on like that, and the expansion, because these central banking systems only work well if you can expand. That's why you always see a correlation between central banks and imperialism. Coming up where ultimately a king who's in debt is told, okay, you can't pay your debt, so go and conquer that people. Go and grab their stuff to pay your debts. And so it always has to expand. And if it continues to expand in geopolitical thinking or senses or economic sense or something like that, it can sustain its own system. And when the Bank of England, it's not the English central bank, it's the Bank of England, a private concern, when they lost access to the North American continent, they realized they could no longer expand in the way that the British Empire was globally expanding. They couldn't expand in this, incredibly pristine continent that was, had become available. And so they fought for, they effectively fought for over 100 years and finally got the job done when the Federal Reserve Act came into being, and the Federal Reserve came into being in 1913. Christmas 1913, 1914 actually beginning its operations. And so I've kind of forgotten the train of thought. I think we were talking about Donald Trump and his ability to
to stop
to challenge these people and so on like that. And I think this claim of what Donald Trump's doing, either he means there's only one way to fight the central bank, and that's how Andrew Jackson did it. You take their charter, you take that monopoly to issue money, and you give it back to the people in the way that the American Constitution stipulated, that their representatives are the only people who are allowed to coin money and so on. And so that therefore the coinage of money and the way the boom bust cycle is down to the election process. As the American, the forefathers of the Constitution, when they wrote that up, intended it to be. And is Donald Trump actually threatening to do what Andrew Jackson did? Because they gave a charter to a Bank of America, which was a central bank, and Jackson killed it. He made sure that bank never was able to establish itself again. I think it was the second bank. The first one, the charter ran out. The second bank, he fought it. They tried killing him. They tried doing all kinds of things. They people are going to go, oh, shut up about this or whatever. But back then, Quincy Adams rigged the election to keep the powers behind him to keep Andrew Jackson out of power. But when he got into power, he killed the bank. And on his deathbed, he said, that was his greatest achievement. I killed the bank. Is this what Donald Trump is talking about? Personally, I would like to think so. I would like to see the Federal Reserve told, I'm sorry, but that debt that you have created, that national debt that you've put the American people into and created a burden on them, it was an onerous debt. It was a debt built on fraud that you perpetrated. And so therefore you are now, to use a modern term, cancelled. And, we are now going to go back to issuing money as it should be, simply as a measure and weight of work done, not as a debt. It becomes a tool. It becomes a measure that you can trust. It doesn't fluctuate because of inflation problems and money supply problems and things like that. So I would hope that would be the case, that that's what Donald Trump is alluding to. And he could do it. There's enough people who are becoming aware of what the Federal Reserve, the beast that system has been for the last 100 years and what it has done around the world, and particularly in the last 30, 40 years with the adventurism of America and suppressing countries that wanted to break away from that system. Iraq, you can go back even Vietnam, but Iraq, Libya, they tried to destroy Syria, managed to hang on. All these different countries, but yeah, I hope he's got that ability to do what Andrew Jackson did.
Yeah, we will see how that plays out, and we will also see if he will even try. Because we know how it is sometimes. The politician during the campaign is not always the same when he is in office.
Yeah. And I think that's, that's the way it's always been, because, I've always imagined, along with other people, that because the last guy to attempt this was John Kennedy. He got his head blown off, as far as I'm concerned, for attempting to put some of the coinage of money back into the hands of the Treasury and therefore under the power of the people and such. And I can see a similar thing happening to Trump if things were as entrenched as they were back then. But things are getting desperate for these central banks. To be honest, Trump is the least of their concerns in terms of the threats he's making, when you consider how out of balance their system has become and the threat that countries like Russia and China are posing. Because whether people in the West like it or not, the propaganda is wrong. Russia is not suffering under sanctions as a result of those being imposed. It's actually become stronger. How is that possible? It certainly wouldn't have been possible 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, such. But somehow Russia has broken free. China has also got the strength to do so. They're creating this BRICS group of nations that have this different idea of how nations should trade, a multipolar world, not as a unipolar world that America wants to create. You see, this is the whole thing. America really, as a nation, didn't want to create a unipolar world. It was the banking establishment that captured America that wanted a unipolar world, with American military might backing up and enforcing its decrees and its desires. And that's what's breaking down. That's what Russia and China had brought to the table in terms of modern politics, this shift into multipolarism, which is the biggest threat to global central banking you can imagine. The idea that peoples and nations could actually decide how they're going to run their own economies or their own internal policies and so on. And no longer is there the control mechanism available to sanction these people into poverty, or and then kill them off the coup de grace of an American invasion.
Yeah, but we also see the efforts around CBDCs in China and in Russia as well.
Sure. Yeah. Again, you know, these are issues that the BRICS nations are going to have to address. China, I'm one of these people who doesn't. A lot of people think that China is an inevitable, future dominance, a nation able to, you had the American century. We're going to be moving into the Chinese century, and so on. And I'm somebody who lived there for 18 years. Amongst the Chinese people, amongst how they think and so on, and the control that China wants to exert on its own citizens is an age-old, uniquely Chinese story. All right. I often talk about the emergence of intelligence agencies around the world, culminating in the Mossad and the CIA in the 20th century. But Britain ran its intelligence agencies, the Vatican did, and all that. Well, China has a history that goes back to BC times in terms of intelligence agencies. But their intelligence agencies have always been inward looking. They spy on themselves, all right? They like building walls to keep everybody out of their affairs and so on. China is not an imperialistic nation that wants to gobble up territory. It already has its empire over its vast multitude of different peoples, because the Chinese people are made up of people of cultures as diverse as Europe is, with its different cultures and so on, even more so. And but because of that legacy of emperors and dynasties in China have always sought to control China as this internally for the sake of stability. Sun Yat-sen's famous quote about China as a shifting tray of sand. And that's what the government is always battling. It's not worried about global domination. It's just worried about making sure its people don't rise up and you get another, fracture in the various dynasties that have ruled, the communists being the latest dynasty, because that's what they've become. They've dropped their pretensions of communism, particularly in the international sense. So they make a good case study for what people in the West want to subject Western cultures to, because you look to China and so on. But China's uniquely, culturally already adapted to that kind of control. But unless you've been there, and I think unless you're Chinese, it's a kind of a control that is always on the edge, that the vast population that China is, no matter who controls it, is always aware they only have to rise up. All right. There only has to be a breakdown and you're out of business as far as running that whole show. It's just too large. Before we had multi-millions of people dying in wars in the 20th century, the Chinese had a rebellion. I think it was the 1870s. It was called the Taiping Rebellion. Right? 30 million people dead. Right? In the days of swords and muskets. There's no nuclear bombs or air forces or anything like that to perpetrate that. That's the scale the Chinese think at. And that's why they always seek some kind of internal control. And many Chinese are acclimatized to accepting that. But there's always that knowledge that if the government goes too far, the people they're controlling as a mass are just too many. It's just the weight of them will bury whoever is in charge, and China will go through that process again. So the Chinese model is not a model that I believe could ever be successful in the Western context. But that doesn't mean to say that the people who are in charge of the central banks and are getting that panic that things are coming to a head, it doesn't mean to say that they're not going to try and implement it.
Yeah. So we have another player on the stage, a relatively new one in terms of politics, and he wants to abolish his central bank, and that is Javier Milei.
Yeah.
So
look, even 10 years ago, the only person talking about abolishing central banks was a guy called Ron Paul. in the United States, father of Rand Paul, the guy, and so on like that. And he'd been talking about it for years, and so on like that. But nobody in their right mind, you can't abolish central banks. It's how the world runs. Now it's open. And Argentina's a serious country in terms of size and influence, and so on. And there he is. He's actually saying it out loud, and he has been elected. Interesting.
Yeah. And but okay, he is very new at his job. Like any other person, he will get the benefit of the doubt for a while, and then we can reassess. But already he faces resistance in his own country.
Yeah.
And just recently, the highest court in Argentina shut down his labor reform. And there were various things in there, like the probation time is now not 6 months, it's 8 months. But there was also something in it that I found weird and not practical at all. He wanted to allow that companies can pay their workers for 12 hours of work 10 liters of milk and 5 kg of meat.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that might work for a day or two. But how are you going to pay your rent with milk and meat? Seriously? What do you do if you need a detergent? So that to me would mean, okay, I worked for 12 hours here. I'm going home with my 10 liters of milk and 5. And let's say you have a whole cluster, like 20, 50, or even 100 workers. I don't even know where the companies want to store all the meat and the milk. I have no idea.
Exactly. That is another aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then everybody has, after work, they have to sell their meat and their milk to get some money so that they can buy maybe diapers or whatever.
Yeah.
So how is that helping anybody?
Yeah. I think what Milei is attempting to do is to give people the option of being able to do that. All right, as opposed to only doing that as a way of paying.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
all
Yeah,
right, do you see what I'm saying? Whereas they literally make it illegal for you to pay people in other ways in a lot of countries, ostensibly because to stop abuse, where sorry, you're going to get paid in chicken eggs, whether you like it or not. No, I want money. So it swings both ways, if you know what I mean, and such like that. And it's because of the state of Argentina, an incredibly blessed country in terms of producing these primary goods, these agricultural goods, and so on like that. That he's hoping to do that. What I think my problem with Milei in understanding him is that he's talking about dollarization of the Argentine economy, and we've just talked about the evilness of central banking, and he's talking about getting rid of the central bank, and I'm going, that's great. But by dollarization, he's sticking Argentina under the American central bank, right, as it stands at this time. It's not really a way. And I know that he has, what reading I did in anticipation, of this interview and so on like that. He said things about, the Federal Reserves are bad banks, and then you get the worst banks around the world, and then you get the really bad ones, and then you get the Argentinian central bank, which he claims is the most corrupt and so on in the world. If my thinking is that dollarization just puts his economy at the whims of the American Federal Reserve, which is in cahoots with an administration that hates Milei. Yeah. All right. Okay. They don't like him, so they're hardly going to allow the American central bank to engage in monetary policy that benefits Argentina while he's president, and so on. It seems a crazy, very, how can I put it? So it puts Argentina in a very vulnerable position, in terms of being under that central bank in America. But there is something else that is also at play. Will Milei also at the same time make cryptocurrencies, maybe Bitcoin, Ethereum, legal tender in Argentina? In other words, are we going to see him institute changes that dollarize, all right, the currency, and thereby get rid of the extremely odious, corrupt Argentinian central bank, which a lot of people don't realize was set up by the British. All right. They don't realize that it was the British who went down there and said, this is how you run a central bank. And so effectively, the Argentinian central bank is a colony of the British bank, the Bank of England. And when I say that, when I say the British, I mean, the Bank of England and the City of London and so on. All right. And that's its origins. And it's one of the most corrupt central banks as a result that you've ever seen. So he gets rid of that, and that's a good thing. He goes into dollarization, but he also gives the Argentinian people the ability to make payments through cryptocurrency. In other words, he follows the El Salvadorian experiment, which is now 2 years, 3 years, I think it is. They've made it, and things, they've had their ups and downs with it and so on, but things seem to be panning out in a positive way for El Salvador when it comes to Bitcoin and so on. And that might be where he is going. I think, however, the biggest crisis that Milei is going to have is that he stupidly, in my opinion, gave the central bank powers, those behind the Argentinian central bank, who are not going to go away. They just lose their jobs and then decide they're going to plot with other central banks for a comeback. But I think they'll use the conflict between Great Britain and Argentina over the Falkland Islands. They will use that as one of their catalysts for ousting Milei at some point, as central banks have always done, have used, events, wars, that kind of stuff. And so I think that's one of his biggest challenges. But I wonder if Milei is actually, got an eye on crypto if he can make that legal tender, because I think a lot of people don't realize that Argentinians aren't sitting around in Argentina stagnating. There is a massive, what they call a gray economy. It's not a black economy, but it's a gray economy where they adapt. And they do pay each other in eggs and ham and milk and things like that to get by. They have to. It's been crazy, in Argentina for that time. And so they're very adaptable to this. And if you give them the right to use crypto as a form of legal tender, that minimizes the control that you're giving the American central bank over the Argentine economy if you just do dollarization by itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was also something that I didn't understand, this siding with the United States. And he also said, no, we are not going with the BRICS. And yesterday he gave a speech in Davos.
Yeah.
And it was not so well received. And he talked about that the West has lost its way and that they left basically the mechanisms that produces prosperity and so on and so forth. He spoke out against wokeism and what have you. And then I thought, well, but actually the United States is the flagship wokeism. So what are you doing there?
Yeah, I mean, this, I'm the guy who writes books about Earth once having been a satellite of Saturn
Yeah.
during the collective human memory of of humankind and so on like that. So a lot of my ideas are way out there and so on. But we've discussed in the past that there is a hidden third element in the world in terms of what Joseph Farrell calls the Nazi International. Dave
Yeah.
Emery refers to as the Underground Reich and so on like that. And we know that a lot of what is claimed about such an organization was centered very much in Argentina in terms of the refugee Nazis. And I'm not talking about the war criminals as in the guys who ran the concentration camps. I'm talking about the professional Nazis who ran the country
Yeah.
during that time. And the idea, which I'm very much believe did actually take place, but the idea that Martin Bormann, whether he survived the Second World War or not, he certainly created a capital flight organization to siphon off money into the international financial arena to basically continue the whole Nazi experiment in a supranational way, rather than just purely focused on Germany and Central Europe, in that sense. But Argentina played a big part in those plans at that time. So when we talk about Milei and his rejection of the BRICS, and we've said the BRICS are breaking away from this evil central banking system and so on like that.
I don't see that the BRICS are doing that.
You don't?
No.
Well, what I think what they're breaking away from is they're breaking away from the ability of central banks to control nations from a central point. Okay, that the system can't dictate. There isn't going to be a BRICS financial system that means that China and Brazil and India can tell Russia, do what we want you to do, or else we're going to sanction and take all your stuff. They're trying to create a multipolar world in the financial sense as well as the political sense. And I think that's what I mean by breaking away from the actual centralized concept, of financial control. But I think that it's something we could discuss, I guess, in the sort of second half or whatever. There's this concept of what exactly happened after the Second World War in terms of this Martin Bormann flight capital, and is it playing a role right now, in what's happening in Argentina? Is this why Milei is what he is? Why he's so associated with Donald Trump and so on? Is it this third element that is exerting itself at the moment and has been doing so since the 2008 crisis, according to people who follow this train of thought? Are we seeing a drama being played out that is from the legacy of this Martin Bormann capital flight organization and its association with Argentina, during those times? And the fact that Milei dubs himself a anarcho-capitalist and so on, and such, is a very interesting concept in terms of that context, that idea, if one wants to go that way, and so on. In fact, I think that kind of, strangeness, why would he break from the BRICS? Why would he put himself under the American Federal Reserve? Why would he do these sorts of things? I think that the idea of the Nazi International, the Underground Reich concept that has been, bubbling away under the surface throughout the world these last 70 years, helps explain things a lot more than just looking at what we have in the media and the mainstream media to go on.
Yeah. Okay. So, Troy, we have already reached the top of the hour. And yeah, that was it. And we will see the patrons on the other side. And I can't wait for hour 2.